In the last two videos, I finished building the overall structure of this messenger program and completed the function for sending messages. In this video, I would like to walk through the code of how I built the function for receiving the messages. However, I would highly recommend you to check out the previous video first, because there are a lot of functions I use in this video are already covered over there. And again, if you want to download the code from my GitHub repository, link in the description. Just like the sender mode, the first thing to do in the listener mode is creating a socket for receiving messages. So I create a socket with IPv4 and UDP in mind, then print socket creation failed and return to the main function if the socket is not created successfully. Unlike just saving the destination socket address in the sender mode, the listener mode also cares about whether the incoming packages is for this particular program. Thus, I need to store all of the information about the listener socket address in the IPv4 socket address structure. Similar to the sender mode, I first create the listener socket address, then clear this whole memory block with zeros. Next, I set the address family as IPv4 and put the local IP address in the IP address slot. This time, instead of explicitly taking and convert an IPv4 address string into its binary representation, I can let the system pick any available one from the local machine. Finally, set the port number the same as the one I choose in the sender mode in big endian byte order. So far, all of the above operations already appeared in the run sender function, but the next one haven't. Let me introduce this bind function. The purpose of this function is to bind the information I saved in the listener socket address to the socket I created earlier. Since it will return 0 if the socket binds successfully and return -1 if it fails, I can use this return value to decide if the function should proceed. If not, then it will print bind failed, close the socket, then return back to the main function. After that, print listening on port 12345 to indicate to the user that it starts actively listening. Because I would like to also print where does the message come from after receiving the message, I create another IPv4 socket address structure for storing the sender's information. Then I create a character array buffer with the size of 1024 bytes, which is more than enough for typical short messages. Next, I create another variable for saving the size of the sender socket address, which will be useful later in the function for receiving messages. The final one is the actual active listening part. I wrap the following code in an infinite while loop. The first action inside the loop is making use of this receive from function to receive the message from the socket I created. The first parameter is for the socket file descriptor to read from. The second one is for the buffer to store the received data, which I just created with the size of 1024 characters. Then is the length of the buffer. However, since 1 byte is reserved for the null terminator, it is the size of the buffer created -1. The fourth one is the flags for control message reception. Again, here I pick the default behavior. The fifth is the pointer to a sender socket address that is transformed to the more general version. Finally, the last one is the pointer to a variable containing the size of the socket address, which I just created right before this while loop. The function will return either the number of bytes received if it runs successfully, or return -1 if error occurs. Saving this return value into a new variable, use it for printing received data on the socket fail, and break out from this loop if error occurs. Next, add a null terminator at the end of the message. For printing the source IP address, here I create another character array for storing the source IPv4 address string. Then use the function that is similar but opposite to the one being used in the sender mode for converting the IPv4 address binary representation to its string format. Then actually print the message with the source IPv4 address. Finally, close the socket, and that's it for this run listener function. So far I have covered everything from the design to the actual implementation of the sender and the listener mode, In the next video, I'll test the code and mention one problem that you might encounter while running this program on your own Linux system. That's it for now. See you next time.